Welcome to the Latin Playground, where we delve into the nature of language, the nuances of NeoLatin, and the spiritual experiences of the scientist and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Never heard of NeoLatin or Swedenborg? No problem. Come learn alongside us as we explore the inextricable link between spiritual revelation and grammar.
I want to give you an example that to me is an example. I was thinking about strengths and weaknesses of Latin versus English. And we could talk a lot more about this, but a striking relative weakness in English is that we pretty much have the word this and the word that. And that's about it. You know, if you're pointing to something, you've basically got this and you've got that. Latin has, I was thinking about that ille in Winnie ille pu. Latin has ille, which means that. It has iste, which means that, and it's kind of bad or striking in some way. So it's a little harsher, as you can hear. It's just like iste, you know, ille is just that over there. Iste is like, what is that? And hic is this over here. And then there are a lot of other, they have so many demonstratives. They have a lot more thises and that's. And as you probably know, each this comes in 30 flavors. We have one. So this can this something way across the room. You know, oh no, I'm an ablative feminine singular this. I go with that ablative feminine singular noun way over there. And you can tell. And one of the problems with old Swedenborg translations is that they would take all those thises and that's, boil all that down. So they'd see he, they'd say this. They'd say is, they'd say this. They say ille, they say that. They say see iste, they say that. And all the 30 flavors of each of 5 or 6 different kinds of this is all get boiled down to this and that. And so Cara will be familiar with the old translations that often it would say blah, 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 blah. And this, so that we may know that, you know, and this what was what I would often be asking myself. And this, so that, well, in Latin, it would be a, you know, a neuter, nominative, or accusative saying, you know, like you have some clue of what it was pointing to.
I wonder if that would be a good thing to find just a side-by-side example of this, of an old translation using all of those thises and that's, and then how it's rendered in the New Century Edition. Because I think that's exactly when I mentioned earlier, when the New Century Edition has this like whoosh, like you're just understanding it better. It was often felt like when you read the older translations, there's just a lot of words that don't have to be there and you're not exactly clear what they're doing there. And so right. So I wonder if the this and the thatness is part of what kind of created this jumble or
Yeah, and I want to talk about Galaxies a little bit and then we'll get into the passage. But after a while, I started to figure out, it took me a long time to try to understand what was not so great about the older English translations of Swedenborg. Because if you looked at the Latin, there's the Latin, here's this word in English. In fact, often that says regeneratio, this says regeneration. They just stuck an N on the end. Can't fault that. Okay, next word, forms in the, you know, whatever. And you can see all the words in there. And yet, when you would read the English translation, it would have this very dry, kind of boring, the sentences are too long, and it sort of felt vaguely abstract and dissatisfying. And after a while, especially after going and getting my PhD in Latin from Bryn Mawr College and being able to read these things in the original and really see the sense of humor, and sometimes Swedenborg's using different word. He could have used this word and he uses that word, and, you know, word choice and things like that. And I scratched my head for a long time, like, what's wrong with this picture? Because yes, that word shows up here. And I finally realized, oh, English and Latin are like two different galaxies. Important thing to know about the Latin galaxy is that the ancient Romans themselves used to complain, maybe you've heard me talk about this before, about the agestas patrii sermonis, the poverty of the father tongue. Latin vocabulary, I'll give you one simple example. The Oxford Latin Dictionary is only a 15th of the size of the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, that's an extremely crude measure, but still, they're two dictionaries done by the same people, essentially, same publisher at least. And that implies that for every Latin word, there's 15 English words, which would mean that for some of them, there are 60, and for some there are only two. There's a few situations like stars where Latin has more words than we have the word star. That's a star. They have different, they have stella, they have astera, they have different words. And so sometimes you run into it the other way. A huge word that Latin doesn't have is any third person singular pronoun. It has a you, it has a me, and then guess what it uses for the missing, uses all those thises and that's. They also, Latin is very strange for having no indefinite article and no definite article. So you can't tell the difference between house and a house and the house. That's a huge thing. The most popular word in Swedenborg translations is the, and there's no the in the Latin. So those are all an interpretation. And so with Winnie the Pooh, you got no the. So you have to say Winnie that Pooh, ille Pooh, because we don't have a the in Latin. Now, there are different ways that Swedenborg gets around that. And so what I started to realize after a while was that there's a whole galaxy of Latin. It's not as large a galaxy as the English galaxy. There's a whole galaxy of English. And part of what helped me about picturing them as galaxies is that the way galaxies do when they move through each other, they'll steal a whole, just 100,000 stars or something. They'll nick from another galaxy. English has eaten Latin multiple times. It's like 3 different times. It ate Latin way back when, Caesar went over there, whatever it was. In early times, it ate it again later. Then it ate Norman French, which had a lot of Latin in it. And then it got some more in the Renaissance. It's eaten Latin over and over again. So yes, almost every Latin word now on Swedenborg's page, you can find in an English dictionary. The thing is, it's a little bit like the strange way that we use in English. We use like Anglo-Saxon words for the animal, but French words for the food. You know this thing?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like it's a cow, but it's beef. That's French,
Yeah.
But there are exceptions. Chicken is chicken. It's interesting. Oh, chicken's chicken. But lamb, veal, like all that stuff, pork, pig, they don't match. And you'll notice that a lot of medical terms are from Latin or from Greek. So if you talk about having a pruritus, it feels different than having an itch. It's just an itch. And doctors get a little nervous around me because I know what they're talking about. When they use the Latin terms for things like that, just it means you have an itchy elbow. Like I know what that means. But it sounds fancier in Latin because the Latinate vocabulary is more upper class or something. All those 4-letter swear words are the Anglo-Saxon or ancient sort of Germanic terms for these same body parts or whatever, but they're considered swear words. And then these Latin terms that we got, those are upscale words. So the problem with borrowing all that Latin vocabulary is that, you remember that example, don't you, Cara, of you used it not that long ago. What is it? Instead of twinkle, twinkle, little star, it's like coruscate.
Scintillate, asteroid, minific.
Yes, very good. And
What was that last word, Cara? That's awesome.
Minific. Minific.
Minific.
Oh,
Small.
little, like so small. So,
Right,
okay.
right. That's right.
Scintillate, asteroid, minific.
Yeah.
It's amazing the extent to which in English, the most powerful and impactful words in the core of the language, and he talks about this a lot in that History of English podcast, are these old English and these old Anglo-Saxon terms from time immemorial, the body parts, all the basic stuff about food and eating and the basic stuff about life. That's the heart and soul of the language. Latin was eaten much later and it was kind of cerebral. So if you're talking all day about Reformation and regeneration, it just sounds abstract.
Yeah.
That's why it feels different. It might be a perfect representation, but in the Latin galaxy, that word is right down in the center of the galaxy. Like I'll give you a great example that I love is concupiscentia. Such a great word. Concupiscentia. The the ISC is related to also Greek words with isko, which are inchoative. They're developmental. They reiterate. So adolescent, that ESC means becoming adult. Crescent means growing, actually. That SC in there. So in concupiscentia, you have that SC in there, which means growing. Con is an intensifier. It means strong. Coop is for lust, desire, craving. It's a strong and growing craving. When you're a Latin head, you see all that in there. But in English, if you use the word concupiscence, you're just using it. There's been inflation. They used to be $10 words. They're now over $20, a lot of those.
Yeah.
That it's not a visceral word. It's not a punch in the gut kind of 4-letter Anglo-Saxon pithy word like ithy. So
and what
Like
you just said of
us.
like a strong and growing craving is like, I get what you mean. You had to use 4 words, but I get it viscerally.
Exactly.
And I get nothing when you say concupiscence or whatever.
Yes, right. That's exactly it. Where if you don't know the Latin root, you look at those words, like people use the word conjugal, in the older translations for the marital relationship. Well, that nothing happens in your brain when you see, you don't see the yoke in there. You don't see the yoking together or anything. If you don't have the Latin root in your head, nothing, no bells and whistles go off in your head. And so it makes it seem dry. And whereas if somebody says marriage, there's some concept in your head about that, so I finally realized, those same words in Latin are from the center of the Latin galaxy. But to translate those faithfully into English, we need to actually turn them into some of those core words, at least, into the old Anglo-Saxon or Norman, or those things that have been around for thousands of years in our language, have that visceral impact.
The core of the galaxy, yeah.
The core of the English galaxy, because all these Latinate terms are on the outer band. They're quite far from the heart of English. We've kindly swallowed them whole, and fine, sure, we'll have, sure, come on in. Words from all kinds of languages, but the core is still those simple, the 82 most frequently used words or whatever it is.
This might be something that is worth noting as we go along, especially when we look at individual passages, is just to like call back to that, to be like, oh, look, this is a center of the Latin galaxy word. And now look, we're translating it into a center of the galaxy English word, whereas we could have used this far outer space word had we wanted to, but just to get, I'm sure we'll find those left and right, but it's like to just nod back to this, I think would be great.
You'll in the old translations, you'll find words like adscititious, or editamentum in English, and
yeah. But Jonathan, is it partly because the explosion of study that happened like during the Enlightenment, for instance, is when Neo-Latin was the thing, was the language of learning, of academia. And so that's why
Absolutely.
all those scientific words, all the words around medicine and philosophy and all those sciences came from the Latin, because that was the Latin everyone was using at the time.
That's right. That's right. So it's a great addition to the language. And a lot of them are sort of like, you'll even have a Latin first half of the word and the second half is Greek. So words like auditorium, or there's a lot of words that came in because of that explosion and got into English.
Wow.
So it was a blessing, and Swedish too. When Swedenborg was growing up, Swedish was quite a crude language in the sense that, you catch a fish, you bring it home, you cook it, you can do all that in Swedish. If you want to talk about syllogisms or ancient Greek philosophy or something like that, the Swedish at the time, now it can do it. And Swedenborg was actually part of trying to get Swedish up to speed to do that. But
and
he
also
really needed to say what he was saying in Latin because the vocabulary. In fact, Hans Solander pointed out years ago that the same people, native Swedish speakers would say, it's so much easier to express this in Latin. I mean, what's the word for that in Swedish? I don't even know. What would you even call that? Another example of how language, so for all those Swedes and Germans and other people all over Europe, getting into Latin and Greek, opened this world of shared thought across all of Europe, which was very exciting to be part of. And Swedenborg was kind of to that group.
So I want to connect back to a couple of things and share a couple of thoughts before we look at this passage. And with that, so I feel like it's useful to define that the Neo-Latin period is from X to X, and Cara just centered it on the Enlightenment, but is that true if you had to put like this century to that century? What exactly is that Neo-Latin?
Great question. The International Association for Neo-Latin Studies dates it from 1300 to 1700.
Okay.
What's fascinating about that is that Swedenborg wrote all his Latin after 1700. So their cutoff date is before Swedenborg even gets going. And it did continue later, but the vernaculars were taking over in a big way after the Protestant Reformation and so on, the German and Italian and Dutch and French and so on.
So they had to coin new terms. Was there like an organization that was approving new terms for new things that were happening with technology and advances, or they were just using the old words
in new ways or something?
There was tremendous amount of neologism of, creating new words or new usages of old words, applying this word to just sort of like hard drive or words that have been around for ages. But what we mean by that is quite different than what,
how would they agreed upon that? How are they like,
a lot of
we're about talking about the same thing when we said hard drive,
A lot of that was a lot of authors at the time had to take pains to explain what they mean. Sometimes even in letters, they would use the French or a different language, to try to see this is what I mean, use examples and all that. And then the more influential authors would be able to kind of establish, they would give the vocabulary to that conversation. And so pretty soon everybody's talking about, if Newton calls his book Principia, pretty soon Swedenborg's doing a Principia, everybody's doing a Principia. That's sort of the word for that type of thing.
Yeah.
And some of the words sort of have a little flash and then they go out of style, and some really catch on, like that is a useful word. But it was kind of the Wild West. There wasn't any group like there was later with the Académie Française, which would say, that's a good French word. You don't use the word weekend, in French. That's English.
So I want to say that one, it would be super fun to have a Neo-Latin scholar from just the world of that association you're talking about sometime. come be a guest on this podcast someday. And
That'd be great.
but then also everything we're talking about language, it's cool to see how it applies to Neo-Latin itself. Like Neo-Latin as an evolution of Latin was creating a language that then allowed and assisted the Enlightenment period, and this huge explosion of new thought and thinking about scientific, fields of study and everything, so that it really kind of was this bursting forth of new exploration into the world that needed a language to support that exploration. And it was Neo-Latin at that one period, so that's such an interesting
that's
reflection.
Partly the Oxford Latin Dictionary is of classical Latin. It stops at I forget what, 600 AD, or it might even be back in 200 AD. There's some sort of cutoff point. And a lot of the words in the Oxford English Dictionary are Neo-Latin terms. They refer to it as late Latin, but you'll see a lot of those are English versions of some of that explosion. So it was more impoverished before the Enlightenment and this explosion of science. And what are we going to call this? What are we going to call that? And,
exactly.
Atmospheric pressure, or how do you talk about these new concepts? So it was absolutely a living language, and it was still a living language when Swedenborg was using it. It was spoken in the classroom. People were coming up with new words all the time, so that's important to realize. People sort of think it died, but it was alive, but it has been in a long decline now as the vernaculars took over from that, and people started to say, okay, I'm going to write this in Dutch, I'm going to write this in English. And
I really think that this through line theme of how language really affects how we think about things, it affects what we're able to understand, what, like, our concept of what's possible is limited by our language. And so to just shine a light on that and realize that even when you share things or new things in the same language, those are new words that are going to create new ideas in your mind. Like, it really opens up possibilities through the power of language. And so it's just such a cool domain to be exploring in this time that we have together.
And the best dictionary, in a way, is the context that the word is sitting right in. It can often tell you, and just by sheer repetition, a lot of how the NCE group has figured out what some of these words mean is we just realized by sheer repetition, both from the frequency of how many times, like there was a word you see a lot in the old translations, proceeding. Well, wow, it was like, wow, everything proceeds. Wow, this was proceeding, and then that proceeds. And wow, they did a lot of proceeding back then. And it's too frequent for English. In English, we'd say go or something. We don't proceed all the time. It's again kind of a formal, little bit of a Latinate word, and we would use all different sorts of words, and so word frequency gets in there too.
That's a wrap on the fun of the Latin Playground for now, a production of the Swedenborg Foundation. As a nonprofit, the Swedenborg Foundation depends on the generous giving of donors who find value in the spiritual ideas we've explored here today. Without Latin translation, we wouldn't be able to share what Swedenborg wrote about, and without the funds necessary to financially support Latin translation, we wouldn't be in a position to even know what Swedenborg dedicated his life to putting down on paper in the first place. We need your help. Please consider making a donation to the Dr. Jonathan S. Rose Translation Fund at swedenborg.com/donate. But if you don't have the means at present, your support in the form of liking this podcast, writing a positive review, and sharing it with a friend is as real as cold, hard cash. We hope you'll continue to learn alongside us here on the Latin Playground.